People often make a risky assumption when they lie to an empath. They believe empathy equals naivety. They think kindness means a lack of awareness. They assume emotional depth somehow dulls perception. Yet the reality is usually the reverse. The very traits that make an empath caring are often the same ones that make them incredibly hard to fool, because empaths are not only hearing words, they are tracking patterns. They are reading emotional cues that most people miss. They notice the pause before a reply, the strained smile that appears a moment too late, the change in tone when certain topics arise, the mismatch between what someone says and what their body seems to express. And this is where intuition is often misunderstood. Many believe intuition is mystical, unclear, or illogical. But much of what we call intuition is actually pattern recognition working beneath conscious awareness. An empath may not immediately accuse you of lying. In fact, they usually won't. But they feel a disturbance. Something doesn't fit. And that inner signal remains even when they try to ignore it. And psychologists have long known that communication operates on multiple levels. Words convey one layer. Behavior reveals another. Emotional alignment or misalignment exposes a third. Empaths are especially sensitive to misalignment. They can detect when someone's words are trying to outrun their truth. And this creates a challenge for the deceiver because lies often depend on managing appearances. They rely on controlling what is visible. But empaths do not exist only at the surface. They focus on what seeps through. A manipulative individual may believe they have concealed the truth because their explanation sounds believable. But the empath is noticing something entirely different. Why did your energy change when that topic appeared? Why did your confidence shift into defensiveness? Why did your explanation become excessive? Why does your apology feel practiced rather than genuine? These are not random feelings. These are observations. And there is something even deeper. Empaths often understand pain, guilt, fear, and shame because they have explored those emotions within themselves. They recognize emotional patterns because they have experienced them. That makes deception far harder to mask in front of someone who understands what inner conflict looks like. And this is why people who lie to empaths often feel frustrated. They feel exposed in ways they did not choose. They sense their act is not working the way they intended. And sometimes they interpret this as judgment when it is actually perception. Now, this does not mean empaths are never misled. In fact, many remain in dishonest situations longer than they should, but not because they failed to notice deception, often because they detect it and then override their own instincts. They rationalize, maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe they're just overwhelmed. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe love means giving them another chance. And this becomes one of the empath's greatest internal struggles. Not recognizing truth, but trusting what they recognize. Because many sensitive individuals have been conditioned to doubt their own perceptions, especially if they have experienced gaslighting, manipulation, or environments where reality was repeatedly distorted. They may sense dishonesty instantly, then spend months trying to convince themselves otherwise. And this is where wisdom begins to develop, because growth for an empath is not about becoming more suspicious. It is about becoming more aligned with reality. It is understanding that if someone's words and actions consistently contradict, the contradiction is the truth. If someone repeatedly creates confusion, that confusion carries meaning. If something feels wrong again and again, that feeling deserves attention. This is not paranoia. This is discernment, and discernment is what transforms empathy into strength. Because empathy without discernment can be taken advantage of. But empathy combined with discernment becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. And this is where many people misjudge the empath. They assume that because an empath stays silent, they are unaware. Because an empath does not immediately confront, they do not understand. Because an empath shows compassion, they must not see clearly. And in reality, the empath often perceives far more than they reveal. They may be observing, they may be waiting, they may be giving you the opportunity to be honest on your own. Because healthy empaths do not rush to accuse. They watch, they confirm. They allow reality to reveal itself, and reality always reveals itself. Because lies have an inherent weakness. They need upkeep. Truth sustains itself. Falsehood requires constant reinforcement, and over time, most deception collapses under the pressure of its own inconsistencies. The empath understands this, even if only intuitively. This is why many empaths seem composed in the presence of dishonesty. Not because they are deceived, but because they understand something fundamental. Truth does not need urgency. And there is something almost philosophical about this. A lie is not just incorrect information. It is an attempt to construct an artificial version of reality. And empaths, by nature, are drawn to authenticity, to what exists beneath performance, to what is emotionally real beneath social convenience. That is why lying to an empath can be so damaging. Because you are not simply offering false facts, you are violating the very principle they base connection on, and they feel that deeply, sometimes before you even finish speaking. So, when someone lies to an empath, they often believe they are concealing something, but what they may actually be doing is revealing themselves, exposing their fear, exposing their character, exposing the gap between appearance and truth. And eventually the empath recognizes that gap clearly, not because they have special powers, but because they are attentive. That is the strength people underestimate. The empath is not reading minds, they are reading patterns, and patterns rarely deceive. And so, if you think deception protects you from being understood, consider this. You may hide details for a short time. You may postpone consequences for a while, but you cannot consistently fake alignment in front of someone shaped by life to notice misalignment. And that is why lying to an empath is never as invisible as it seems, because the first-person deception reveals is often the one creating it. And that leaves us with something important to remember. When words and energy clash, trust the pattern. Truth often speaks quietly long before it becomes obvious. And once deception is sensed, something even deeper begins to unfold. Because for an empath, a lie is rarely just a false statement. It is experienced as a break in the emotional structure of trust. And most people underestimate what trust truly represents. They treat it like a simple social agreement, a convenience, a default in relationships. But for an empath, trust is far more significant. It is emotional safety. It is the unseen framework that allows vulnerability to exist. It is the silent understanding that what is real between two people will be respected. And when that understanding is broken through deception, the damage is rarely just about the lie itself. It is about what the lie represents. Because when someone lies to an empath, the injury is not simply "you misled me." The injury is "you made me build emotional truth on something false," and that is betrayal. Betrayal is not disagreement. It is not conflict. It is not even always wrongdoing. Betrayal is the collapse of trusted reality, and this impacts an empath differently because they do not connect on a shallow level. They invest through meaning, through emotional consistency, through genuine honesty. So when dishonesty enters that connection, it does not remain at the surface. It echoes through everything the relationship was built upon. Suddenly, the empath is not only questioning the lie, they are questioning every moment connected to it. Was that apology genuine? Was that promise real? Were those words ever true? Was I loved sincerely? Or was I being managed? And this is where one lie becomes psychologically greater than the event itself. Because deception does something deeply disruptive to the mind. It creates doubt about the past. It causes previous experiences to feel unstable. And when the past feels unstable, the nervous system does not interpret that as a small issue. It reads it as danger. This is why betrayal often feels traumatic, because in many cases it is. The brain processes relational betrayal in ways strikingly similar to other forms of emotional harm. There is heightened alertness, overthinking, repetitive thought cycles, and difficulty trusting one's own perception. And for clear's throat, an empath, someone already attuned to emotional undercurrents, this can cut incredibly deep. Because what they offered was not casual trust. It was genuine trust. And sincerity, when broken, often turns into pain. Now, this is where many people completely misread the empath. They assume the empath is hurt because they are overly emotional, too sensitive, too attached, too idealistic. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. The empath is hurt because they valued truth, because they believed honesty mattered, because they approached the relationship as something meaningful enough to deserve integrity. And that is not weakness. That is moral depth. And in fact, one could argue that what makes betrayal painful is exactly what makes trust meaningful. If trust could be broken without consequence, then it never held much value in the first place. And empaths understand this instinctively. That is why even seemingly small lies can carry significant weight, because an empath is rarely measuring the size of the lie. They are measuring what it reveals about character. And this is a distinction many people fail to grasp until it is too late. You may think the issue was the concealed truth, but the real issue is what hiding it communicated. That you chose control over honesty, image over intimacy, self-protection over truth. And that changes how that empath perceives you, sometimes permanently, because once deception is revealed, something shifts. The empath may still care, may still love, may still try to understand, but innocence begins to fade. And innocence, once lost, is difficult to regain. And this is why repeated dishonesty creates such deep consequences with empaths, not because they react with dramatic anger, but because they begin to withdraw trust at the level where relationships truly exist. And when trust withdraws, connection becomes performance. Conversations become guarded. Vulnerability becomes limited. Presence becomes cautious. The relationship may appear unchanged on the outside, while internally it has already started to collapse. And often the person who deceived does not even realize this is happening because they believe betrayal is only visible when someone leaves. But often betrayal becomes visible long before departure. It shows up in emotional distance, in silence, in reduced openness, in the gradual closing of access, because an empath, once hurt deeply enough, does not always explode. Sometimes they simply stop opening doors. And in that may be the greater consequence, because anger can still be relational. Anger still engages. Silence born from broken trust is something entirely different. It is disengagement, and that is far harder to repair. Now, there is a deeper truth worth considering. Every lie attempts to control perception, but every act of trust is an offering of reality. And when you betray trust, you are not just distorting perception, you are dishonoring that offering. That is why betrayal carries such weight. It violates something essential that human beings need to thrive together. And empaths, perhaps more than most, feel this at a profound level because they do not simply seek connection, they seek alignment. And deception destroys alignment. And this is why lying to an empath often creates a consequence the deceiver never intended. It does not just expose dishonesty, it teaches the empath where not to invest their heart again. And once that lesson is learned, access changes, sometimes permanently. So, if someone trusts you deeply, if they offer honesty, emotional safety, vulnerability, understand the responsibility within that. Do not treat their trust as something strong enough to survive repeated damage, because trust is rarely destroyed in one dramatic moment. It erodes through repeated violations, and what erodes slowly often disappears quietly. And silence can be the final sign that betrayal has already taken its toll. And this is why lying to an empath is such a serious mistake, because what you believe is hidden may become the very thing that reveals you as unsafe. And once someone sees you as unsafe, persuasion rarely restores what integrity could have protected. Because trust is not repaired through explanations. It is repaired through consistent truth patiently over time. And many people only understand of honesty after they have lost someone who valued it. But by then, the lesson has already turned into consequence. And that leaves us with something worth remembering. A lie does not only distort facts, it damages the reality two people were trying to build. And once that reality breaks, rebuilding it costs far more than telling the truth ever would. And after betrayal has been recognized, after the patterns have become undeniable, after trust has been broken, after the empath has struggled internally with doubt, forgiveness, rationalization, and painful clarity, something begins to change. Not suddenly. At first, but quietly, almost unnoticed. And this is where those who underestimated an empath often make their biggest mistake. They assume the empath will continue explaining, continue confronting, continue offering chances, continue returning to negotiate what should never have needed negotiation in the first place. But there comes a moment when awareness solidifies into decision. And when that happens, the empath's silence becomes one of the most misunderstood forms of power. And because silence in this context is not passive, it is not confusion, it is not surrender, it is resolution. And there is a profound psychological shift within that moment. Before this stage, the empath may have invested immense energy trying to preserve the connection, trying to understand the other person's motives, trying to repair what honesty could have prevented, trying to save the relationship through communication. And this is important to understand. Empaths rarely walk away at the first sign of betrayal. They often stay much longer than people realize, not because they are weak, but because they believe in healing, because they tend to see wounds beneath harmful behavior, because they interpret brokenness before malice, and because they do not easily abandon what they care about. But endurance has limits. And once those limits are reached, the same person who once fought hardest for the relationship may become the one who leaves most decisively. This is the part many manipulators fail to anticipate because they mistake patience for dependence, compassion for tolerance, understanding for permission, and those are dangerous misinterpretations because what appeared to be endless accommodation was often intentional grace. And grace, once exhausted, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it becomes silence, and silence is powerful because it signals something essential. The empath is no longer trying to persuade you to be honest. They have accepted what you have shown, and acceptance changes behavior. And there is no more arguing because arguing assumes the other person is open to truth. There is no more over-explaining because over-explaining often comes from hoping misunderstanding is the issue. There is no more emotional chasing because pursuit ends when reality becomes clear. And suddenly, the energy that once flowed outward toward fixing, saving, and understanding turns inward toward boundaries, toward dignity, toward self-respect. And this is where silence stops being absence and becomes authority because the empath is no longer reacting to deception. They are responding to truth, and truth simplifies everything. And from a psychological perspective, this shift is powerful because manipulators often depend on emotional engagement. Conflict sustains them. Defensiveness sustains them. Repeated, clear-throat explanations sustain them. Your need for closure sustains them. But silence removes participation. And when participation is removed, the dynamic begins to collapse. Because many unhealthy relational patterns require your continued emotional involvement to survive. Silence disrupts that system, and that is why it feels so powerful. Not because silence is punishment, but because it is non-cooperation with distortion. It is a refusal to keep negotiating with what has already been made clear. And there is something deeply philosophical in this. At a certain point, wisdom is knowing when further conversation serves truth and when it only extends confusion. That distinction can change everything because many people believe strength lies in saying more, explaining better, making one final point that forces understanding. But often true strength appears when explanation ends because you no longer need your reality validated by someone committed to denying it. And that is freedom. And this is the realization many empaths eventually reach. I do not need to keep proving what I know. I do not need to beg for honesty from someone choosing deception. I do not need to reopen wounds searching for closure from the source of pain. That understanding is transformative because it moves the empath from emotional entrapment to psychological independence. And once that shift happens, their silence unsettles others because silence removes access. It removes emotional control. It removes leverage, the predictable pattern the other person expected to continue. And suddenly, the one who believed they were in control realizes that control depended on the empath's continued participation. But the empath has stepped back, and that shifts everything. Now, let's be clear. This is not the silent treatment. This is not manipulation through distance. This is not artificial coldness. This is something far more grounded. It is intentional disengagement. It is the refusal to keep investing energy where integrity is no longer present. And there is dignity in that. There is clarity in that. There is self-respect in that. Because silence, in its highest form, is not about punishing someone else. It is about no longer abandoning yourself. And for many empaths, this may be the most important lesson they learn, because they have often been conditioned to choose harmony over truth, understanding over boundaries, compassion over self-protection. And silence becomes the point where those imbalances are corrected. The moment they stop confusing sacrifice with love. The moment they stop believing loyalty means tolerating repeated betrayal. The moment they understand that peace is sometimes found not in fixing a broken connection, but in leaving it. And here is what people often realize too late. When an empath becomes silent, it does not mean they have stopped feeling. It often means they have felt enough. Enough snorts confusion, enough dishonesty, enough erosion of trust, enough evidence. And once that threshold is reached, silence is not a loss of power. It is an expression of it. And because sometimes the strongest thing an awakened person can do is stop participating in what diminishes them. That is what makes this silence so misunderstood and so powerful. It does not seek attention. It withdraws it. It does not threaten consequences. It becomes one. And often, by the time the other person understands what that silence represents, the emotional door has already closed. Because the empath did not begin leaving when they stopped speaking. They began leaving when they stopped believing. Silence was simply the final visible sign, and that leaves us with something worth remembering. When truth has been revealed, silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most powerful statement you will ever make. And this brings us to the final mistake people make when they lie to an empath, the most dangerous one of all. They assume the empath will never leave. They believe empathy guarantees permanence. That understanding ensures unlimited access. That forgiveness means endless chances. And this belief is built on a deep misunderstanding of what empathy truly is. People confuse empathy with weakness because they only see its softness. They see compassion, patience, emotional depth, tolerance. What they fail to see is that healthy empathy is not the absence of boundaries. It is compassion guided by awareness. And awareness, when fully developed, knows when connection has turned into self-betrayal. And this is where the miscalculation happens, because the person who repeatedly lies often mistakes the empath's willingness to stay as proof they always will. And repetition creates overconfidence. They begin to assume there will always be another apology, another reconciliation, another chance to repair damage after dishonesty. And that belief becomes a form of blindness because they stop recognizing that each lie is not just an isolated act. It is erosion, a gradual wearing away of trust, respect, and emotional safety. And erosion is dangerous precisely because it is often unnoticed until collapse. The empath may still be physically present, still speaking kindly, still acting with grace, and yet internally something essential may already be pulling away because leaving often begins long before it is visible. And people think relationships end when someone walks away. Often they end when someone stops investing hope. And that distinction matters because many are shocked when an empath leaves. They call it sudden, unexpected, out of nowhere, but it is rarely sudden. It is cumulative. The outcome was forming quietly while the signals were ignored. And that is the tragedy because the one who deceived often mistakes the absence of immediate consequences for the absence of consequences entirely. But delayed consequences are still consequences. And sometimes they are the most permanent kind. And now here is where this becomes deeply reflective. To be loved by an empath is not something ordinary. It means being seen with uncommon depth. It means being understood in ways you may not even understand yourself. It means being given emotional access that many never receive. And when someone has that level of access, they often fail to recognize its rarity until it is gone. Because people tend to undervalue what is consistently present. Presence becomes assumed. Grace becomes expected. Loyalty becomes taken for granted until one day it disappears. And then what seemed ordinary reveals itself as extraordinary. And this is often when regret arrives. Not when the lie is told. Not even when trust first cracks, but when the empath stops returning. When the emotional presence they once held disappears. When the understanding they once offered is no longer available. When the person who once saw your wounds and still cared is no longer there. And that loss is often far greater than the deceiver expected because they did not just lose a relationship. They lost a rare kind of human connection, and rare things are often only recognized once they are gone. And now, this is where people misunderstand the empath's departure. They think walking away is revenge, punishment, retaliation. But mature empaths do not leave to cause harm. They leave to protect what remains of truth within themselves. That distinction is everything because leaving at its highest level is not rejection. It is a refusal to continue participating in what violates integrity. And there is profound strength in that, especially for someone whose nature is to endure. Because for an empath, leaving is rarely the first instinct. It is often the hardest decision they make, which is exactly why, once made, it is usually final. And because it was not impulsive, it was considered, felt, examined internally, reached only after multiple boundaries were crossed. And this is what many fail to understand. When an empath leaves, they are often not reacting to the last lie. They are responding to the entire pattern, to everything accumulated, everything tolerated, everything clarified through repetition. And patterns carry more weight than single moments, which is why one last apology rarely changes anything. Because the issue was never one event. It was what those events revealed, character. And once character is seen clearly, perception changes permanently. And this is why the greatest mistake is assuming an empath will stay simply because they care deeply. Because sometimes those who care the most are the ones who leave the most completely when truth is violated. They understand the cost of remaining where honesty no longer exists, and eventually they refuse to pay it. Now there is a lesson here that extends beyond relationships. It is about how we treat what is valuable. Because anything repeatedly taken for granted eventually withdraws. Trust withdraws, respect withdraws, access withdraws, and sometimes people withdraw not in anger but in clarity. And clarity is difficult to reverse because once illusion fades, it rarely returns. And the empath now sees what they once tried not to see, and seeing changes everything. This is why lying to an empath is such a serious mistake, because the lie does not just risk conflict. It risks losing someone whose presence may have been far more rare than you realized. Someone who saw beyond your defenses. Someone who offered understanding instead of judgment. Someone who may have stayed through things others would not tolerate. And if you lose that through deception, the loss may not be replaceable. And because not everyone who enters your life will understand you deeply, not everyone will offer repeated grace. Not everyone will fight to maintain connection. And when you mistake that rarity for something permanent, you may destroy what you assumed would never leave. That is the danger, and it is also the warning. Never interpret patience as permission. Never confuse forgiveness with the absence of limits. Never assume a kind heart has no breaking point, because the strongest boundaries are often formed by those who have loved the deepest. And then once those boundaries close, no amount of regret can always reopen them, because some lessons do not arrive as advice. They arrive as loss. And loss is a difficult teacher, often final, which leaves us with something worth remembering. The greatest mistake is not lying to an empath. It is believing they will stay after they have seen who you become when you choose deception.